I look at my hands. They're not the same as they were 40 years ago. The skin is blotchy and thin as parchment, and the veins are bulging blue rivers. But those hands still remember how to hold a knife. Those fingers still feel the texture of perfectly cooked dough. 72 years old is not a verdict, even though my son-in-law Richard thinks otherwise. My name is Virginia Hughes. I was once known as Jenny, a Michelin-starred chef, author of 3 cookbooks, and the face from the covers of cooking magazines. Now I'm just an old lady to most people and a burden to my family, sitting on welfare. And I'm perfectly fine with that. At least for now. I opened The Last Touch a year after Henry died. My husband always wanted us to have our own place, but his career as a military surgeon didn't leave him much time to dream. We were always putting it off, first because of his business trips, then because of Charlotte's birth, then because of my cooking career. And then he had a stroke, and Henry was gone. Suddenly, no warning, at 64, life isn't fair. The day I signed the lease for the restaurant space, Charlotte had already been married to Richard for 3 years. She was persistent in suggesting that I sell our house, the same one Henry and I had bought 30 years ago, and move into an upscale retirement home. "Mom, you'll be fine there," she said. "There are other people your age there." My age. Like it was some kind of disease, like I needed the company of other infected people. I smiled and nodded, and then I went to the bank and made a down payment on the restaurant. The money Henry and I had been saving for a rainy day, and the insurance I'd gotten when he died, were my starting capital. But I told my family that I'd put it all into renovating the house, a phrase that made Richard almost physically cringe in disgust. It pissed him off that I was squandering money that could have gone to them after I died. The final touch opened without fanfare. I didn't want my name associated with the restaurant in the press. We just quietly opened the doors, and word of mouth did the trick. First came my old fans, then their friends, then undercover critics. 6 months later, you could only book a table 3 weeks in advance. Another year later, we got our first Michelin star. All this time, my family thought I was moonlighting as a consultant in some no-name restaurants to not feel useless. That's how I think Richard put it at the last family dinner. I remember that evening with painful clarity. It was Charlotte's birthday. She turned 42. Richard insisted on celebrating at their home. I arrived with a small cheesecake I'd baked myself. Classic New York cheesecake, Charlotte's favorite since childhood. "Oh, Mom, thank you," Charlotte said with a strained smile, picking up the box. But Richard had already ordered dessert from the restaurant. I nodded as if it didn't matter. My cheesecake went into the fridge, and later I noticed it in the trash can, untouched. At dinner, Richard dominated the conversation, as usual. My son-in-law is a financial analyst, a man with a brilliant mind and a complete lack of empathy. Tall, trim, with carefully styled dark hair and a perpetual half-smile of superiority. He's the kind of man who ages beautifully. At 45, he looks barely 35, and he never misses an opportunity to emphasize the difference between us. "How's your part-time job, Virginia?" he asked then, pouring himself a second glass of wine. "Still teaching youngsters how to cut onions?" "Yes, something like that," I replied, sipping my water. "I do some menu consulting sometimes." "That's commendable." He nodded with the same smile. "At your age, it's important to feel useful. Charlotte said you've always been a hard worker. The workaholic runs in the family. It's genetic, isn't it?" Charlotte laughed nervously. "Richard's just kidding, Mom. He appreciates your commitment to being proactive." "Of course I do," Richard confirmed. "I just don't see why you have to work so hard. I mean, you've done everything you can in life. It's time to rest." "All I can do? It's like my life is over. It's like I'm living out my last years." My daughter didn't object. She had long ago become her husband's shadow, a woman who agrees with everything he says. It didn't start all at once. Charlotte has always had a strong personality, went into me, as Henry used to say. But Richard had methodically, drop by drop, etched that strength out of her. First, with the trick compliments. You're so smart, but sometimes you overcomplicate things. Then with doubts. Are you sure this is the right decision? Maybe you should think about it some more. And finally, with direct instructions. Look, honey, I know better. I watched this process and remained silent. Maybe it was my mistake. Maybe I should have intervened sooner. But Charlotte always rejected my attempts to talk about their relationship. Mom, we're fine. Don't make up problems where there aren't any. After that dinner, I didn't see them for almost a month. Charlotte stopped calling, citing busyness at work. She works as an accountant at the same financial company where Richard works. He helped her get a job there 10 years ago. Another strand of control in his hands. I didn't push for meetings. I had enough to do at the restaurant, a new seasonal menu, problems with suppliers, finding a new sous chef. Yes, at my age, many of my peers are babysitting grandchildren or traveling, but I've always been different. Henry understood that and was supportive. He was the only man who never tried to change me. Charlotte and I don't have a bad relationship. It's just, empty, formal. Birthday and Christmas calls, occasional special occasions. She doesn't know that I still get up at 5 a.m. to get to the restaurant in time for deliveries. Doesn't know that I personally test every significant recipe before it hits the menu. Doesn't know that the final touch is my real family. Jeremy, my executive chef, often says I should tell my daughter the truth. You should be proud of yourself, Virginia, he says, and your family should be proud too. But I'm not sure Charlotte would be proud. More likely she'll be annoyed that I've kept such an important part of my life from her. And Richard, I can imagine his reaction. First distrust, then calculated interest. Suddenly, I'm not a liability, but a valuable asset. I wonder how soon he'll start hinting at the family business. Sometimes I wonder if I'm playing too hardball, but then I remember all the little humiliations Richard used to present as jokes. All those moments when Charlotte chose his side, even though she knew he was wrong. Poor old lady, she just doesn't understand modern life. Of course, Virginia, we appreciate your experience, but perhaps we should listen to the younger generation? Charlotte, is your mother out of her mind? Who in their right mind would refuse such an offer? That was when they wanted me to sell the house and move in with them. I refused and Richard didn't speak to me for a week. Charlotte called every day, begging me not to hurt Richard, as if I was a capricious child, not a 70-year-old woman with the right to decide where and how to live. My little revenge, hiding my real life, started right then. I realized that the only way I could find out what they really thought of me was to let them think I had nothing but a pension and an old house. Jeremy doesn't realize this. He's young, he's barely in his 30s, and full of idealism. He believes that the truth is always better than a lie, that a family should support each other unconditionally. Perhaps that's the way it is in his world. But I've lived enough to know that a family can be the most dangerous place to be if there is no love in it. Does my family have love? Last night I dreamt about Henry. We were sitting in the kitchen of our old house before it was renovated, and he was looking at me with his kind brown eyes. Jenny, he said, it's time to stop hiding. When I woke up, I lay in the dark for a long time, thinking about his words. Am I hiding or just defending myself? Where is the line between self-preservation and cowardice? In the morning, looking over the reservations for the following week, I noticed a familiar name. Richard Foster, table for 4, Friday, 20 o'clock. For the first time in the restaurant's 6 years of existence, Richard has decided to dine here. Of course, he doesn't know it's my restaurant. He probably heard a recommendation from a coworker or a customer. I could have canceled the reservation, citing a technical glitch. I could have taken the night off and not shown up at the restaurant that night. I could have called Charlotte and revealed my cards ahead of time. But instead, I confirmed the reservation and asked Jeremy to put me on the Friday night shift. After all, it was time to face the truth. His truth, my truth, our family lies. I don't know what will happen when Richard sees me at the final touch. Not as a customer, not as a part-time consultant, but as the owner of a place that's one of the top 100 restaurants in the country. But no matter what happens, I'm ready. Perhaps my son-in-law will finally see me, the real me, not the caricature of old age he has created in his imagination. I sit in my office in the back of the restaurant and go through old photos. I've never allowed myself this kind of sentimentality during work hours before, but the impending meeting with Richard and Charlotte has me going back in time. There's Charlotte in her prom dress, radiant and full of hope. Here's Henry and I at our silver wedding. He's already noticeably graying, but his eyes are still young. And here's a picture I usually try to ignore: Charlotte and Richard's wedding. Their acquaintance was banal to the point of obscenity, a corporate party where Charlotte got there by accident in company with a friend. Richard was just starting his career in a financial company, but already had a reputation as a rising star. Handsome, smart, ambitious, the perfect groom, as my mother would say. I remember Charlotte talking about him after their first date. Cheeks flaming, eyes shining, words leaping over each other. The classic crush of a 30-year-old woman who was beginning to dread being alone. Henry was still alive then, and we were both happy for our daughter. But when Richard first came over for dinner, I noticed something unsettling. I can't explain what it was. Maybe the way he looked at our house with an appraising gaze, or the way he smiled condescendingly as he listened to Henry's stories about his work at the field hospital. Little things that could be chalked up to the nervousness of meeting my fiancé's parents for the first time. "He's just shy," Charlotte said when I gently shared my observations with her after they left. "You're too picky, Mother." Perhaps I was being picky. After all, who could be good enough for my only daughter? But the worry never left me. With each visit, Richard became more and more confident in our home, and more critical. Not directly, of course. He was too smart for that. "Oh, you have such a cozy home," he said with a slight smile. "So traditional." I could tell it was old school. It sounded old-fashioned and outdated to him. Henry used to laugh and say something like, "At least you don't have those smart speakers listening to every word." My husband was a kind man. He always tried to see the best in people, even in Richard, especially when Charlotte announced her engagement just 6 months into the relationship. "It's too soon," I told Henry that night. "She barely knows him." "She's 31, Jenny," my husband replied, putting his arm around me. "We can't tell her how to live her life, and he seems like a nice guy." "Kind of nice," was the highest praise Henry could give Richard. I think he sensed something was wrong, too, but didn't want to mar his daughter's happiness. The wedding was lavish, Richard insisted. 200 guests, of whom I knew barely 20. The rest were his colleagues, business partners, and some people he called useful connections. Charlotte looked lovely in her designer dress, but strangely lost amidst all the luxury, like she was a guest at her own wedding. Henry died a year after their wedding. The stroke happened in the morning. He just didn't wake up. The doctors said it was instantaneous, that he didn't agonize, as if that could be comforting. At the funeral, Charlotte wept inconsolably. She adored her father. Richard stood by her side, putting his arm around her shoulders, the model supportive husband. But I noticed that every time another sympathizer approached, he seemed to turn on, straightening up, his expression appropriately mournful. And when no one was looking, he'd glance at his watch. After the funeral, Charlotte offered to let me stay with them for a few days. I declined. I needed to be alone, in a house full of memories of Henry. Richard didn't like that. Virginia, be reasonable, he said in the way one speaks to a fractious child. You have just lost your husband. You can't be alone. I can manage, I said firmly. I'm 65, not 85. I'm quite independent. Mom, please, Charlotte intervened. Richard's right. You're better off with us. It was the first time I noticed that tone in her voice, a mixture of irritation and patronization, as if I was a problem to be solved, not a person going through grief. I refused anyway, and that was the first stumbling block between us after Henry's death. Richard apparently took my refusal as a personal insult. In the months that followed, his attitude toward me grew increasingly cold. It was around that time that I began to think about a restaurant. Cooking had always been my salvation. Even as a child, when my parents were fighting, I would hide in the kitchen and experiment with recipes. Then it turned into a career, which I partially left when Charlotte was born and then resumed when she went to school. I told Charlotte about my idea to open a restaurant, hoping for encouragement, but she only frowned worriedly. Mom, it's a huge risk, especially at this stage of your life. At this point in my life? I interjected. You mean at my age? No offense, she said quickly. It's just that statistics show that most new restaurants close in the first year, and it's so stressful. Does Richard think so? I asked him directly. Charlotte blushed. We both do. Richard's just concerned about your well-being. We both are. That evening, as I was about to leave, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. They didn't know I'd come back for my forgotten scarf. It's crazy, Richard said. She's just wasting money that could have gone to your inheritance, for our future. It's her money, Charlotte objected quietly. She has the right to use it as she pleases. She's a 65-year-old widow who's about to start senile dementia. Richard's voice was full of irritation. Your father would be furious if he knew she was going to throw their life savings away on some crazy adventure. I froze, not believing my ears. Senile dementia? To me, who'd just gotten a full medical exam with perfect vitals for my age. Don't say that, Charlotte said, but somehow unconvincingly. She had always loved to cook. Loving to cook and running a restaurant are different things, Richard retorted. Look, honey, I know you want to be a good daughter, but sometimes protecting a parent means stopping them from doing something irreparably stupid. You have to talk to her. Convince her to invest that money in a safe bond or something. I can help with that. I have connections at the bank. I walked quietly out of the house, forgetting my scarf. A storm of emotions raged inside me. Anger, resentment, frustration. But strongest of all was a sense of determination. I knew now that I was going to open a restaurant. To spite Richard, to spite everyone who thought life was over at 65. And I did it, without their help, without their knowledge. The final touch was my answer to their doubts, silent but eloquent. Charlotte never mentioned that overheard conversation, and I never admitted to hearing it. But something had changed between us. She started calling less often. Our conversations became more and more superficial. And when we did see each other, usually at family dinners at their house, Richard always found a way to insert some derogatory comment about my age or lifestyle. It's amazing how you still drive, Virginia, he once said. You don't react the same way at your age. Or, do you still read paper books? That's nice. You know, they have electronic books that can enlarge the font. It's very handy for, you know. Each phrase was a little jab, each meant to emphasize my old age and not up to date. And each time, Charlotte was less and less supportive. And then she started to agree with him. Mom, maybe you should think about an emergency button. She asked after Richard's comment about the dangers of living alone at such an advanced age. Why? I asked. Well, just in case. Charlotte hesitated. You're the only one in the house, like millions of other people my age all over the country, I said dryly, who are doing just fine on their own. But they're not my mother, Charlotte said, as if that was the decisive argument. It was one of the last sincere conversations we had. After that, we saw each other less and less. Charlotte always found an excuse work, fatigue, some urgent matter. I didn't insist. Pride wouldn't allow it. Meanwhile, the final touch was thriving. We got our first mention in the Michelin Guide 2 years after we opened. Then came the awards, the articles in culinary magazines, the offers of collaborations. I enjoyed the success, but kept it a secret from my family. It became my shield, my privacy, where Richard's disdainful gaze could not penetrate. Charlotte knew, of course, that I was counseling at some restaurant, but she never asked for details, and I never told. Sometimes I fantasized about inviting them to the final touch and seeing the shock on their faces when they realized it was my establishment, but I always put that moment off. Perhaps out of fear that even then Richard would find a way to devalue my accomplishments. The situation reached a critical point about a year ago when Charlotte called with a proposal that clearly came from Richard. Mom, Richard and I have been thinking, she began cautiously. Your house is too big for one person, and it's expensive to maintain. I can manage, I interrupted. Yes, of course, she agreed quickly. But imagine how much you could get if you sold it now, while the market was booming. You could buy a small apartment in a nice neighborhood and invest the rest of the money. Richard knows a great financial advisor. Charlotte, I said calmly, though I was seething inside. I'm not going to sell the house I've lived in for 40 years, the house where you were born and raised. But that's just unreasonable. Richard's intonation came into her voice. You're spending money to maintain a house you don't need. It's, it's irresponsible. To who? I asked her bluntly. To you? To Richard? To your future inheritance? There was a long pause. That's not what I meant, she said at last, but there was no certainty in her voice. I think you did, I replied. And you know what? This is my house and my money. I'm going to use it as I see fit. If that's a problem for you and Richard, I'm sorry. After that conversation, we pretty much stopped talking. Charlotte called only on holidays, and visits were limited to rare official lunches, at which Richard ostentatiously discussed his financial successes, as if trying to emphasize that, unlike me, he knew how to handle money. I plunged even deeper into my work. The final touch got a second Michelin star. We expanded the space, added a private room for special events. Jeremy, my executive chef, became not just a colleague, but a close friend, one of the few people I trusted completely. Virginia, you have to tell your daughter, he'd say as he watched me stare at the picture of Charlotte in my office. It's ridiculous to hide such a success. It's not time yet, I answered each time, and now it seemed the time had come. As fate would have it, Richard had chosen my restaurant for an important business dinner. Jeremy put a printout of the reservation on my desk. Is this the Richard Foster? He asked, even though he knew the answer. Yes, my son-in-law himself. I nodded, studying the details. Table for 4. I wondered who he'd invited besides Charlotte. Would you like me to cancel the reservation? Say there was a system error? I shook my head. No, let him come. It's time to face the truth. Jeremy looked at me with concern. Are you sure? It could be, unpleasant. I'm sure, I said firmly. And please put me on the evening shift on Friday. I want to be here when they come. Jeremy nodded, though I could tell by the look on his face that he didn't approve. I spent the rest of the day thinking about the upcoming meeting. What would I say when Richard saw me? How would Charlotte react? And most importantly, am I prepared for the consequences? After this dinner, our relationship would inevitably change, for better or worse. In the evening, looking through the mail, I noticed a letter from Richard's assistant asking me to clarify the details of the reservation. She wrote that Mr. Foster was planning an important meeting with potential investors and wanted to make sure everything would be top notch. This is an extremely important evening for Mr. Foster, the letter read. He has heard about your restaurant and is sure it is the perfect place for this level of negotiation. I smiled at the irony. Richard, who had looked down on me for years, now had high hopes for my restaurant without even realizing my role in it. I replied briefly and professionally, assuring him that everything would be organized in the best possible way. And I added a note. We look forward to seeing Mr. Foster and his guests on Friday. Oh, how I look forward to that meeting. Friday came all too quickly, and at the same time, agonizingly slow. All week I had been in a strange state of excitement and anxiety, waking up every morning thinking, one more day to go. Jeremy watched me with ill-concealed concern, but didn't interfere. Over the years we'd worked together, he'd learned to recognize when I needed space. On day X, I arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. I wanted to personally check all the little things, although in my mind I realized that my team would do fine without me. The last touch has long been a well-oiled mechanism where everyone knew his role, but tonight was special. I needed to feel in control of the situation. It's going to be a full house tonight, Jeremy said, looking at the reservation list. All the tables are taken, plus a waiting list. Including my brother-in-law's table. I nodded, trying to sound casual. Jeremy gave me a quick glance. Are you still sure you want to be here when they come? Absolutely, I answered firmly. I'm not going to hide in my own restaurant. The hours dragged by agonizingly slowly. I caught myself checking the time every 10 minutes. 19:20? 19:30. Richard's reservation was for 20:00, but knowing his punctuality, I expected them to show up about 15 minutes before the appointed time. At 19:45, I decided to go out into the hall. Usually on Friday nights, I stayed in the kitchen or the study, preferring to watch the restaurant from the sidelines. But tonight I wanted to be in plain sight when Richard and Charlotte walked in. I wanted to see their faces. Putting on my best suit, a sleek navy blue tee that accentuated my figure and hid my age, I stepped out into the room and began making my way around the tables, saying hello to the regulars. It was part of the charm of the final touch, the personal attention of the owner, who knew many of the guests by name and remembered their preferences. At exactly 19:55, the front door opened and I saw them. Richard walked in front, tall, trim, in an impeccable suit, exuding the confidence of a man accustomed to expensive places. He was followed by Charlotte in an elegant black dress, which I knew Richard considered modest enough, but of status, and two other middle-aged men I didn't know. Obviously the same potential investors. I remained standing at the far table, chatting with an elderly couple, my longtime clients who came in every Friday to celebrate the end of the work week. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched as the maitre d' greeted the new arrivals and escorted them to a table in the center of the room, the best table, usually reserved weeks in advance. Richard seemed pleased with the arrangement. He nodded with the look of someone who'd gotten exactly what he'd expected and deserved. They settled down, and I saw Charlotte looking around with slight admiration. I knew that expression, the way she'd looked at the world as a child, when Henry and I had first taken her to the art museum. The moment of truth was approaching. I said goodbye to the elderly couple and moved slowly toward Richard's table, pretending to just walk around the room. When I was only a few steps away, Charlotte looked up and met my gaze. A second of confusion was followed by shock. "Mom?" she said loud enough for Richard to turn sharply in my direction. Virginia? His tone was a mixture of surprise and annoyance. What are you doing here? I approached their table with the most welcoming smile I could muster. Good evening, Charlotte, Richard. What a pleasant surprise. Richard's face contorted. He quickly looked back at his guests, who were watching the scene with curiosity, and tried to take control of the situation. This is my mother-in-law, he explained with a strained smile. What a coincidence to meet you here, Virginia. Are you dining alone? His voice was clearly filled with surprise and something else. Concern? He obviously hadn't expected to see me in such an expensive restaurant, and now he was trying to figure out what I was doing here. Not really, I answered calmly. I work here. You do? Richard asked with a nervous chuckle. You mean counseling? Like other places? I saw Charlotte looking at me with confusion. She, too, couldn't understand what her old mom was doing at one of Jacksonville's most prestigious restaurants. Something like that, I answered evasively, savoring the moment. And you're here on business, I take it? Richard nodded hastily and turned to his guests. Gentlemen, may I introduce my wife's mother, Virginia Hughes. Virginia, this is Mr. Bradford and Mr. Ellington of Argos Investments. Mr. Bradford, a graying man with attentive eyes, nodded courteously, but something akin to recognition flashed across Mr. Ellington's face. Virginia Hughes? He said slowly. Wasn't it the Virginia Hughes who— But Richard didn't let him finish, clearly in a hurry to turn the conversation to business and get rid of my presence. Virginia, we're very pleased to meet you, but we have an important business dinner planned. Perhaps you should— And then he did it. Perhaps he was nervous about the situation. Perhaps he really wanted to get back to the important negotiations quickly. But Richard leaned toward me and said with a quiet, condescending smile, The poor don't belong here. You do realize that the average bill here is more than your monthly pension, right? There was a silence in the room, although I knew in my mind that it was not so. The other diners were still talking and enjoying their dinner, but for me there was only this moment, these words, this arrogant expression on the face of the man who had considered me a burden for the past 15 years. I saw Charlotte turn pale. She opened her mouth as if about to say something, but she remained silent. The gentleman at the table looked embarrassed. Apparently Richard's tone seemed inappropriate, but Richard, engrossed in his own superiority, didn't notice anything. Richard, Charlotte began quietly, but he interrupted her with a slight gesture. Darling, your mother certainly didn't mean to interfere with our meeting. I'm sure she just wanted to say hello and was just leaving. He turned to me again with the same condescending smile. Isn't that right, Virginia? At that moment, Jeremy came over to our table. Apparently watching the scene from afar, he decided to intervene. Good evening, he said in a formal tone. I trust everything is all right? Everything's fine, Richard assured him hastily. Just a little family reunion. Reunion. Jeremy nodded with a professional smile and turned to me. Madam Hughes, the chef is asking if you could spare a minute to consult on the new dessert menu, unless, of course, you're busy. Madam Hughes? Richard asked, shifting his perplexed gaze from Jeremy to me. Do you two know each other? And there it was, the moment of truth. I could have delayed the revelation, could have made up some story about how I'd been consulting at this restaurant for years, but suddenly I felt tired of the whole game. Jeremy, I said calmly, meet my son-in-law Richard, his wife, my daughter Charlotte, and their guests. Richard, Charlotte, this is Jeremy Prescott, executive chef of The Final Touch and my closest colleague. Richard's face expressed complete incomprehension. Colleague? What are you talking about? Jeremy smiled, clearly enjoying the situation. Oh, you didn't know. Madam Hughes owns this place, And I have to say, the best chef I've ever worked under. There was silence, real silence when no one at the table made a sound. I could see Charlotte looking at me with wide eyes that read distrust mixed with pride. Pride? Richard looked as if someone had kicked him in the butt, and Mr. Ellington suddenly smiled broadly. I thought so, he exclaimed. Virginia Hughes is the same Jenny who created this place. I was right, madam. I am a great admirer of your cuisine. My wife and I celebrate our wedding anniversary here every year. Now it's my turn to be surprised. Are you, a regular customer? Oh, yes, for 4 years now. He nodded enthusiastically. Your panna cotta with lavender and honey is the best dessert I've ever had, and the duck breast with cherry sauce is a masterpiece. He turned to his coworker. John, you won't believe it. We are incredibly lucky. We're dining with Virginia Hughes herself. Mr. Bradford seemed to be impressed as well. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hughes. I've heard great things about your restaurant. All this time, Richard sat with a frozen face, obviously trying to comprehend what was happening. Charlotte looked at me as if she was seeing me for the first time. Mom, she started quietly. You own the final touch? All this time? I nodded, suddenly unsure. Perhaps I should have told her the truth sooner, not waited for such public exposure. Yes, dear, 6 years. I wanted to tell you, but— But what? Charlotte looked confused and a little hurt. Why did you keep it from us? Richard finally regained his composure. Is this some kind of joke? His voice sounded unnaturally high. You can't own this place. It's one of the most successful restaurants in town. And why shouldn't I? I asked quietly, looking him straight in the eye. Because I'm too old? Because I'm about to get senile dementia? Richard shuddered, recognizing his own words from years ago. He cast a quick glance at his business partners, who were watching the unfolding family drama with interest, and tried to take control of the situation. That's not what I meant, Virginia. It's unexpected. And impressive, of course. He smiled strainedly. You should have told us. We would have supported your initiative. Would we? I raised an eyebrow. Even if it involved spending money that could have gone to Charlotte's inheritance? For your future. Richard's face tensed. He recognized those words, too. Charlotte shifted her gaze from him to me, clearly not understanding the context. What are you talking about, Mom? I sighed. I didn't want to turn this moment into an even more awkward scene, especially in front of strangers. It doesn't matter, dear. Let's discuss this later. I turned to Richard's guests. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to meet you. I hope you enjoy your dinner. Jeremy will see to it that your table receives special attention. It's an honor, Madame Hughes, Mr. Ellington said with genuine admiration. And I must say that the prospect of investing in Mr. Foster's projects now looks even more attractive given his family connections. Richard, catching an unexpected opportunity to turn the situation in his favor, hastily intervened. Yes, my mother-in-law is an amazing woman. We've always admired her entrepreneurial spirit. I almost laughed at that shameless lie, but I held back. Instead, I decided to finish him off with one last punch. By the way, Mr. Ellington, while we're on the subject of connections, I said casually, I'm very familiar with your CEO, Lawrence Holder. We play bridge every second Thursday of the month. He mentioned that Argos is looking for promising projects in the restaurant business to diversify its portfolio. Mr. Ellington's face brightened. That's exactly right. And your restaurant is exactly the type of business we're interested in. Perhaps we could discuss a potential partnership? I'd love to, I nodded. Why don't you come to my office after dinner? We could talk casually. Richard looked at me as if he'd seen a ghost. His face turned pale, then red. He clearly understood what was going on. His potential investors were far more interested in his mother-in-law's business than in his own projects. But we were planning to discuss my proposal, he began uncertainly. Oh, we'll definitely discuss it too, Mr. Ellington assured him. But it's not every day you get a chance to talk to a legend of the restaurant business. Charlotte still looked shocked. She looked at me as if trying to reconcile the image of her old mom with the image of a successful businesswoman standing in front of her. Mom, I don't understand, she said quietly. Why didn't you ever tell me? There was resentment in her voice, and I felt a prick of conscience. Maybe I'd gone too far in my little experiment. We'll talk about it, dear, I promised. But now was not the time or place. Jeremy, who had tactfully taken a few steps away during our conversation, approached again. Madam Hughes, the chief would really like your advice, if you don't mind. I nodded, grateful for the excuse to leave. Turning around the table one last time, I saw Richard, still sitting stone-faced, and Charlotte looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of surprise, resentment, and pride. Enjoy your meal, I said with a slight smile. Jeremy, please make sure my family's table gets the best service possible. As always, ma'am. He nodded with a note of pride. As I left, I could feel the stares, not only from my family, but also from the other guests, who must have noticed the tense scene. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't care what others thought. I felt strangely relieved, as if I'd shed a heavy weight I'd been carrying for years. It wasn't over, of course. The conversation with Charlotte was still to come, and it wouldn't be easy. But the hardest part was over. The secret was out. The masks were off. And the look on Richard's face when he heard I owned the restaurant was definitely worth all the years of silence. After the dramatic reveal, I spent the rest of the evening in the kitchen, watching my team work and occasionally peering out into the room through a small window in the door. Richard's table was clearly visible from here. I watched my brother-in-law smile strainedly, trying to regain control of the situation. Charlotte looked confused, barely participating in the conversation, absent-mindedly rubbing her napkin. Mr. Ellington, on the other hand, was animated and, judging by his gestures, was saying something fascinating, probably sharing his impressions of his previous visits to my restaurant. Do you think he'll apologize? Jeremy asked, coming up behind me. Who? Richard. I grinned. No doubt he would, but not because he's remorseful. He'd just quickly recalculate all the possible benefits of being related to the owner of a successful restaurant. Jeremy shook his head. Charlotte looks shocked. You need to talk to her. I sighed. I know, but not today. Let her digest the information. To my surprise, neither Richard nor Charlotte made any attempt to speak to me as they left the restaurant. Perhaps the presence of business associates was holding them back. Or, more likely, they just didn't know what to say. Mr. Ellington, however, stopped by the kitchen to express his admiration and exchange contacts. He was indeed interested in investing in the restaurant business, and I promised to contact him later for a more detailed discussion. I returned home past midnight, physically and emotionally exhausted. I didn't get to sleep until the morning, and I was awakened by the ringing of my phone. It was 9:30. Mom, it's me. Charlotte's voice sounded uncertain. We need to talk. Good morning, darling. I reached for my glasses. Yes, we definitely need to talk. Can I come over now? I could hear the nervousness in her voice. Alone. Richard's in a meeting. Interesting. She emphasized that she would be alone. Charlotte didn't usually do anything without her husband's approval. This little act of independence was reassuring. Sure, I'll make coffee. 40 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Charlotte stood on the doorstep, looking pale and sleep-deprived. The dark circles under her eyes suggested she'd had a restless night, too. Come in. I stepped aside. Coffee's ready. Charlotte walked silently into the kitchen, the heart of our home, where she and I had once cooked Sunday lunches together for Henry. Those memories seemed so distant now. You look tired, I said, pouring her coffee. I couldn't sleep, she admitted, wrapping both hands around the cup as if to warm herself. I kept thinking about last night, about you, about the restaurant. I sat across from her, waiting for her to continue. Why didn't you tell me? Charlotte looked up, and there was so much pain in her eyes that my heart squeezed. 6 years, Mom. 6 years you pretended to be a practically penniless pensioner while you owned one of the most successful restaurants in town. Why? To make fun of us? I shook my head. To find out the truth, Charlotte, about how you and Richard really feel about me. And what was the result of the experiment? She sounded sarcastic. Did we fail? Fail the test? You know the answer to that, I answered quietly. Richard had never hidden his attitude toward me. To him, I've always been a burden, an aging relative to be put up with. And as the years went by, you began to see me through his eyes. Charlotte flinched as if I'd struck her. It's not fair. I've always loved you. Love isn't just a word, Charlotte. It's actions. It's respect. I took a sip of coffee. When was the last time you defended me to Richard? When was the last time you took an interest in my life, not out of politeness, but genuinely? She lowered her eyes. We both knew the answer. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said quietly. It's just, Richard's hard to argue with. He's always so sure he's right. And he used to say that he cared about you, that he was concerned about your well-being. He was worried about my money, Charlotte, I said bluntly, that I wouldn't spend it on something that wouldn't benefit him in the future. Charlotte blushed. That's not true. Richard is just a practical man. He wanted you to invest wisely. In his projects, I added, which somehow never attracted the same investors that were at the restaurant last night, until yesterday. Charlotte remained silent, staring into her cup. Then suddenly, she looked up. You're a successful businesswoman, she said with a kind of childlike surprise. My mom owns a Michelin-starred restaurant. That's unbelievable. In her eyes, I saw a glimmer of the admiration I'd once seen when she was little, and I'd shown her how to whip a meringue perfectly. I've always been more than just your mom, Charlotte, I said softly. Always been a person with her own ambitions, her own dreams, her own talents. Henry understood that. And you did too, until Richard started telling you that at my age you should retire quietly and stay out of the way of the young. Charlotte sighed. Yesterday Richard was out of sorts when we got home. First he yelled that you'd deliberately arranged the humiliation. Then suddenly he was saying he'd always admired your energy, your business sense, that we should mend our relationship, get closer. She grinned sadly. For the first time, I saw right through him. I saw how fake he could be. I watched my daughter carefully. Perhaps this was the breakthrough, the moment of insight I'd been waiting for. How do you feel? I don't know, she admitted. Confusion, resentment, at you for hiding such an important part of my life, at Richard for suddenly becoming a different person when he found out about your status, and at yourself for letting it all happen. She looked up at me, her eyes full of tears. What am I supposed to do, Mom? I reached out and put my hand over hers. For starters, think about what you really want. Not Richard, not me. You, Charlotte. What do you want for yourself? She looked so lost, as if the question had never occurred to her. Maybe it had. For too long she'd lived at her husband's behest and forgotten what she wanted. Our conversation was interrupted by the ringing of the phone. I glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number. I'm sorry, I said to Charlotte and answered it. Hello? Virginia, it's Richard. My son-in-law's voice sounded unnaturally cheerful. How are you? I hope I didn't wake you. I glanced at Charlotte, who tensed when she heard my husband's name. No, I didn't. To what do I owe the honor? I wanted to apologize for yesterday. He sounded what he probably thought was genuine remorse. I was stunned, shocked, and frankly, a little out of sorts. I said too much. I hope you understand and don't hold a grudge. Of course, Richard, I replied in a neutral tone. Don't worry about it. Good, he sounded enthusiastic. I've been thinking, why don't we get together? Talk face to face? I could stop by or take you to lunch. It's not a good time, I said, looking at Charlotte. I have company. Oh, he sounded disappointed. Well, maybe later. I'd really like to discuss something with you. I have some ideas for your restaurant. I ended the conversation, promising to contact him later, and glanced at Charlotte. She was looking at me with an expression that was a mixture of fatigue and some new determination. He's not going to change, is he? She asked quietly. People rarely change, Charlotte, I said softly, especially if they don't have to. She nodded as if making some kind of decision inside herself. Will I stay with you tonight? Can I? I need to think, away from him. Of course, I squeezed her hand. Your room is always waiting for you. That same day, Richard showed up at the restaurant. Jeremy had called to warn me that my brother-in-law insisted on seeing him. When I arrived, Richard was waiting in the lobby with a bouquet of flowers and that fake smile I knew so well. Virginia, he exclaimed when he saw me. I'm so glad to see you. Richard, I nodded demurely. Come into my office. In his office, I watched him examine the pictures on the walls, my magazine interviews, my awards, my certificates, my accomplishments that I had so carefully hidden from my family. Impressive, he said, looking at a photo of me shaking hands with the mayor at the restaurant opening. You've always been an ambitious woman. What can I do for you? I asked, not responding to his attempts at flattery. Richard sat down, nervously adjusting his tie. I've been thinking about our situation, and I realized that Charlotte and I were wrong to insist that you sell the house and move. It was disrespectful. Really? I kept my expression neutral. What changed your mind? The fact that I owned a profitable business? Richard blushed, but quickly pulled himself together. No, it didn't. It's just that last night got me thinking. He stopped talking. By the way, Mr. Ellington was very impressed with you. Did he mention the possibility of an investment? That's it, the real reason for his visit. Not an apology, not a desire to mend relations, a business interest. Yes, we discussed it, I replied evasively. Good. Richard perked up. I could help with the negotiations, with the paperwork. It would be good for all of us. All of us? I raised an eyebrow. Well, as a member of the family, I could represent your interests. For free, of course. That's very generous of you, I said dryly. But I already have a CFO and a lawyer. Richard looked disappointed, but quickly pulled himself together. Of course, of course. I just wanted to help. Like a son-in-law. Like, family. Family. I repeated thoughtfully. It's interesting that you only brought that up now, Richard, not when you said I was going out of my mind. Richard's face contorted with ill-concealed anger. You spoke to Charlotte. It wasn't a question, but a statement. What did you tell her? Only the truth, I answered calmly. You'll regret this, he said quietly, almost hissing. I can be a very unpleasant enemy, Virginia. As a friend, apparently, I replied, still calm. I'm not afraid of you, Richard. The only thing I worry about is Charlotte's happiness. After Richard left, I sat still for a long time, thinking about our conversation. His threats didn't scare me, but his confidence that Charlotte would make the right choice, that is, choose him, was troubling. He knew how to manipulate her. In 15 years of marriage, he had learned all her weaknesses, I decided to use this situation to help my daughter see her husband's true colors, not by forcing my opinion on her, but by giving her the opportunity to see the contrast between his past and present behavior, between his words and his actions. Charlotte deserved the truth, and the choice she would make should be an informed one, not dictated by fear or manipulation by Richard. Charlotte stayed with me for 3 days. Richard called her incessantly, but she answered rarely and briefly. I didn't eavesdrop on their conversations, but I could tell from her tense face that he was using all his favorite tactics, from threats to sweet promises. Charlotte held firm, though I could see how hard it was for her. 15 years of marriage couldn't be undone in one day, no matter how unpleasant the revelations. On the fourth morning of the fourth day, I offered to show her around the restaurant, not as a visitor, but as a member of the owner's family. She agreed with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in her eyes in a long time. We arrived at the Last Touch early, before it opened. I led Charlotte through the service entrance, showed her the kitchen, pantries, and wine cellar. I introduced her to the staff. Many of them had worked with me since the opening and had become almost family. Jeremy welcomed us especially warmly. "I finally met the legendary Charlotte," he exclaimed, shaking her hand. "Your mother has told me so much about you." Charlotte gave me a surprised look. "Really?" "Of course," Jeremy nodded. "Madame Hughes is proud of you. She worries sometimes, though." I coughed, signaling that the subject was getting too personal, and Jeremy tactfully turned the conversation back to today's menu. After the tour, Charlotte and I settled into my office. I pulled out a nice bottle of wine. Not that I approved of drinking during work hours, but today was a special occasion. "To new beginnings," I said, raising my glass. "No secrets." Charlotte clinked her glass with mine. "No secrets," she repeated, and took a sip. "Mom, this is amazing. You built all this from scratch, and I didn't even know it. How could you hide such success?" I set the glass aside and looked at my daughter. "Not right away, Charlotte. At first, I just didn't want to bother you until things settled down. You know how it is, new business. 90% of them close in the first year. I didn't want you to worry." "And then?" "And then," I sighed. "Then I overheard you and Richard talking about how I'm throwing money away on a crazy venture, about how he's worried about your inheritance. Do you remember that night?" Charlotte frowned, trying to remember. "Vaguely. We often discussed your finances. Richard was worried that you were, mismanaging your money. Money that didn't belong to him," I said softly. "You see, darling, when I heard that conversation, I realized that Richard only saw me as a potential inheritance, and that hurt. But it hurt even more to realize that you were beginning to look at me through his eyes." Charlotte blushed. "Mom, I've never—" "Let me finish," I interrupted her. "After that conversation, I decided to test. How would you treat me if you thought I had nothing but a pension and an old house? It was an experiment, yes, a cruel one perhaps, but I wanted to know the truth." Charlotte was silent, her eyes downcast. "And what did the experiment show?" she asked at last. "That Richard never saw me as a human being," I answered honestly. "Only a burden when he thought I was poor, and a valuable resource when he found out I was successful. And you let him convince you that I was less important than I really was." "That sounds awful," Charlotte whispered. "It is awful," I agreed. "But you know what? It's partly my own fault. I could have told the truth a long time ago, could have confronted him openly. Instead, I chose to play hide and seek, maybe out of pride, or out of fear that even knowing the truth, you'd still choose his side." Charlotte looked up at me, her eyes full of tears. "I wouldn't choose." "You already have, darling," I said softly. "Many times, when he told me I needed to sell the house because it was too big for one." When he insisted I should wear an emergency button like I was an infirm old woman. When he suggested I should be tested for dementia because I disagreed with his political views. Charlotte shuddered, obviously remembering those instances. I thought he was really worried about you. He probably believed it himself, I shrugged. People are surprisingly good at fooling themselves when it's to their advantage. We were silent for a moment. Charlotte was twirling her glass in her hands, absorbed in her own thoughts. Tell me about the restaurant, she asked suddenly. How did it all start? I smiled, grateful for the change of subject. Your father's dream, actually. Henry always wanted us to have our own business, something creative, something to bring people together. But his career as a military surgeon didn't allow time for such projects. And then he was gone. And I thought, why not? Life's too short to put dreams on hold. I told her about the first few months, finding the space, renovating, hiring staff, about how my knees trembled on opening day and how I prayed that at least someone would come, about the first reviews and how gradually visitors began to return to us, about the Michelin star, an unexpected but well-deserved award. It was the happiest time of my life after you were born, I confessed. To create something from scratch, to see it grow, to see how people appreciate your work. It's an incredible feeling. And you didn't share it with anyone. I could hear the resentment in Charlotte's voice. I had Jeremy, I said, the whole team. They became my second family. But not me, not your own daughter. Charlotte shook her head. You know, I'm angry too, Mom. You talk about honesty, about trust, but you've led a double life for 6 years. It's not fair. You're right, I agree. It wasn't fair and cowardly. I should have told you the truth a long time ago, no matter how Richard would have reacted. Charlotte took a big sip of wine. Speaking of Richard, does he know I'm here? You didn't tell him? I said I was traveling on business. She smiled weakly. The first lie in a long time. Strangely, it was easier than I thought it would be. I looked at my daughter carefully. Charlotte, there's something else you need to know about Richard and his, financial situation. She tensed up. What do you mean? After that night at the restaurant, Mr. Ellington contacted me. I began cautiously. We were talking about investing in the expansion of the final touch, but the conversation turned to Richard. He mentioned that your husband had tried several times to attract investment from their foundation, but had been turned down every time. That's impossible. Charlotte shook her head. Richard said that Argos was interested in his projects, that they were almost ready to sign a contract. I'm afraid that's not true. I pulled a folder from my desk drawer. It's confidential. Ellington wasn't supposed to show it to me, but he wanted me to know who I was dealing with. Here's a copy of the last rejection Richard received, and the reasons why. Charlotte took the folder with obvious reluctance, as if she was afraid of what she might find in it. She looked through the document slowly, and I could see her face change from disbelief to shock, then to anger. This, this can't be true, she whispered. It says here that his company is on the verge of bankruptcy, that he has massive debts, that his investment strategy is irresponsible and bordering on fraud. I'm sorry, Charlotte, I said quietly. No, she slammed the folder shut. They're wrong. Richard's a financial genius. He always told me that our investments were growing, that we're doing just fine. And when was the last time you checked your accounts yourself? I asked gently. Charlotte opened her mouth to answer, but fell silent. I could see in her face that she was trying to remember but couldn't. He handles the finances, she said finally. We have a division of labor. I handle the house, he handles the accounts. I understand, I nodded. But maybe we should check it out, just for your peace of mind. Charlotte shook her head again, but not so confidently. Even if he's having temporary difficulties, it doesn't mean he's A bad person. Business is ups and downs. Of course, I agreed. I'm not saying he's a bad person because of financial problems. I'm saying he lied to you about them. And now he's trying to use me and my connections to solve his problems. You don't know that for sure. Charlotte's voice sounded stubborn, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. You're right, I don't, I paused. But what I do know for sure is that the day after that dinner, Richard sent me a letter offering to pool our resources. He wanted to be my CFO, or, as he put it, take on the burden of financial decisions so I could focus on the creative side. He offered you that without consulting me? Charlotte looked shocked. Yes. And when I declined, he sent another letter suggesting that I set up a family trust. Basically, he wanted control of my assets. Charlotte covered her face with her hands. I can't believe it. It's not like Richard. No, darling. I gently pulled her hands away from her face. It's very much like the Richard I know. Maybe not the Richard you want to see, but the real Richard, an ambitious, calculating man who's always looking for an advantage. Charlotte didn't answer, staring into the space in front of her. I could see her struggling with loyalty to her husband and a new uncomfortable truth. I could show you the letters, I suggested, if you want to be sure. No. She shook her head. I believe you. It's just, it's too much. First, I find out that my mother is a secret businesswoman. Now it turns out my husband is a near-bankrupt man who's been lying to me for years. What else don't I know about my life? There was such desperation in her voice that my heart sank. Charlotte, I don't want to ruin your marriage, I said, taking her hands in mine. I just want you to know the truth, so you can make decisions based on facts, not illusions. What decisions? She asked bitterly. Leave her husband after 15 years of marriage, starting over at 42? It's scary, Mom. I know. I squeezed her hands. And I'm not saying you should leave him. Maybe you can make things right. Maybe now that you know the truth, you can build an honest relationship. But you have to decide what you want for yourself. Not me, not Richard, you. Charlotte sighed. I don't know what I want. For 15 years, I did what he wanted. I thought it made me happy. And now I'm just confused. That's okay. I smiled at her. Confusion is the first step to clarity. Give yourself time. You can stay with me for as long as you need. Charlotte shook her head. No, I have to go home. Talk to him. Get his side of the story. She stammered. Though I don't even know how to ask him about the finances without him guessing how I know. Be careful, I warned. Richard is a manipulative man. You know that yourself. I do, she smiled weakly. But I see him more clearly now, thanks to you. We hugged, and I felt the tension that had been between us for years begin to melt away. For the first time in a long time, we spoke as mother and daughter, not as rivals for Richard's attention. After our conversation, I showed Charlotte how to prepare the signature dish of the final touch, duck with cherry sauce from a recipe Henry had once devised. We stood at the stove together, and for a moment I felt like I was back to the time when she was a little girl watching me cook Sunday dinner with fascination. I'd like to come here more often, Charlotte said when we were done. Maybe even help out once in a while, if you don't mind. I'd be happy to, I replied sincerely. When it was time to say goodbye, Charlotte gave me a big hug. Thank you for your honesty, Mom, even if the truth is unpleasant. The truth is liberating, I said, remembering Henry's favorite phrase, always. As I watched her get into the car and drive away, I had mixed feelings. Relief that I'd finally told the truth, worry about how Charlotte would handle talking to Richard, and hope, fragile but real hope, that she would find the strength to make the right choice, whatever that choice might be. That evening, Charlotte texted me. At home. Richard's in a meeting. I promise to be careful. Love you, Mom. I replied, Love you, darling. I'm always on your side. I spent the rest of the evening at the restaurant watching my team work and reflecting on how strange life is. For 6 years, I had hidden my success from the people closest to me, afraid of their reaction. And now that the truth was out, I felt freer than ever. Jeremy approached me as I sat in my usual corner, watching the room. Is everything all right, Madam Hughes? Yes, I smiled at him. I think everything will be all right now. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, how Richard would react when he realized Charlotte knew the truth about his financial situation, whether my daughter would have the strength to resist his manipulations. But I knew that whatever choice she made, I would be there for her. Not as a rival, not as a judge, but as a mother who loves her daughter and wants the best for her. In the meantime, for now, I could savor the moment. A quiet evening at the restaurant I created from scratch. A daughter who, albeit belatedly, saw me for who I am. And hope for the future, uncertain but full of possibilities. The 2 weeks after our conversation with Charlotte passed in tense anticipation. My daughter called me every day, but she spoke little about Richard, reluctantly. I didn't insist. I knew she needed time to sort out her feelings and make a decision. Once she mentioned that she'd started checking their joint accounts, but she quickly changed the subject. I could guess from her tone. She had found confirmation of what I had told her, but wasn't ready to discuss it yet. In the meantime, I'd made a decision that had been brewing inside me for months. It was time to hand over the reins of the final touch to younger hands. Not because of age. At 72, I still felt full of energy, but out of a desire to change my life, to try something new. Perhaps to write the cookbook I'd long dreamed of, or to travel, getting to know the cuisines of different countries. Jeremy was the obvious candidate to succeed me. Over the 6 years we worked together, he became not just an executive chef, but a close friend, someone who shared my vision and understood the philosophy of the restaurant. He was talented, ambitious, and most importantly, able to lead people without causing unnecessary conflict. When I shared my plans with him, he was stunned. Are you sure, Mrs. Hughes? You are the finishing touch. Your soul is in every dish, every detail of the decor. That's why I can leave, I smiled. My soul will remain here, even if I'm not in the kitchen every day. And you will bring something new, fresh. Restaurants, like people, need to evolve. Jeremy agreed, albeit with some trepidation. We decided to organize a gala event to announce the change in management, something elegant but not flashy in the vein of the final touch. We invited restaurant critics, regular customers, friends and partners, and of course, my family. Charlotte immediately agreed to come, but was hesitant about Richard. He's been very busy lately, she said uncertainly. This is an important event for me, Charlotte, I replied calmly. I'd like you to be there. Richard can join me if he wants to. On the day of the event, I arrived at the restaurant before anyone else. I wanted to be alone with my brainchild before announcing the transfer of control. I walked through the kitchen, the lounge, the cellar, the places where I'd spent thousands of hours over the past 6 years. Every corner held memories of the first customer, the first critic's praise, the first Michelin star, of the long evenings when Jeremy and I experimented with new recipes, of the joy when the next dish turned out perfectly. My office, the cozy little space where I spent my mornings planning menus and orders, was now nearly empty. I'd already taken most of my personal belongings home, leaving only what was to go to Jeremy. On the table was an envelope with the speech I'd prepared for tonight. I rewrote it 3 times before I was satisfied. By 6 p.m., the guests began to arrive. The staff, dressed in elegant black and white uniforms, greeted them at the entrance. Champagne, light hors d'oeuvres, quiet music, everything had been thought out to perfection. I stood at the entrance to the main hall, Personally greeting each guest, Charlotte came alone, looking both excited and determined. She was beautiful in a simple black dress, a dress I was sure she'd chosen herself, not at Richard's behest. "Mom," she hugged me, "you look amazing." "You too, dear." I pulled away to get a better look at her. "Richard couldn't make it?" "He will," she said with a slight smile. "He'll be a little late. He had an important meeting." I nodded, showing no surprise. Honestly, I hadn't expected Richard to show up at all, given our last conversation and his obvious dislike of me. But, on the other hand, my son-in-law had always been able to maintain the image of the perfect family man in public. As the hall filled up, Jeremy and I walked up to a small podium. He looked solemn and a little nervous in his new suit. I looked around at the crowd, critics, businessmen, longtime clients who had become friends. Mr. Ellington from Argos Investments stood in the corner, talking to another investor. Charlotte had taken a seat in the front row, leaving an empty chair next to her, obviously for Richard. And then I saw him. My son-in-law entered the hall impeccably dressed, with a smile on his face. He nodded to a few acquaintances, waved hello to Charlotte, and took the seat next to her as if nothing had happened. It was as if the scandal at the restaurant, my exposure, and his threats hadn't happened. The perfect son-in-law at a public event. I coughed and brought my glass to my lips. "Good evening, dear friends," I began, and the room slowly quieted. "Thank you for coming to share this special evening with me. The final touch has been my dream, my passion, my second home for the past 6 years, and tonight I want to announce an important change." I paused, feeling the tension building in the room. "I am stepping down as executive director and chef of the final touch." A surprised whisper swept through the room. I saw Charlotte straighten in her chair, and Richard stepped forward with sudden interest. "Don't worry," I smiled. "The restaurant will continue to operate, just under new management. Jeremy Prescott, my friend and colleague, the man without whom the last touch wouldn't be what it is today, is taking over." I gestured for Jeremy to come forward. "Jeremy, it is with pride and complete trust that I hand over our baby to you. I know you will care for him with as much love and devotion as I have." Jeremy, unaccustomed to being emotional, hugged me tightly, and the hall erupted in applause. I noticed Richard lean over to Charlotte and whisper something in her ear. Her face remained impenetrable. "Before we move on," I said as the applause died down, "let me share a few thoughts. 6 years ago, when I opened the final touch, many people thought it was crazy. A widow in her 60s starting a business in one of the most competitive fields? I heard many doubts, many caveats. My gaze paused on Richard for a moment. Some said that at my age it was time to settle down, to keep my head down, to live modestly. That ambition is the prerogative of the young. That old age should be quiet and inconspicuous. I saw Richard squirm in his chair, clearly recognizing his own words. But you know what? They were wrong. Life doesn't end at 60 or 70 or even 80. It just changes. And each of us has the right to decide exactly how it changes. Applause filled the room again. I noticed the nods of approval from the older guests. They knew exactly what I was talking about. "But today, I want to talk about more than just age," I continued when it was quiet again. "I want to talk about honesty, about transparency, about the importance of being yourself, with your loved ones, with your coworkers, with yourself." I took a sip of water, feeling a lump come up in my throat. I have a confession to make. I'd been leading a double life all these years. To most people, I was Virginia Hughes, a successful Michelin-starred restaurateur. But to my family, I was just a retired widow moonlighting as a counselor. I glanced at Charlotte. She was looking at me carefully, without judgment. I hid my success from the people closest to me, out of pride, out of fear of being misunderstood, out of a desire to protect myself from certain expectations. It was a mistake. A lie, even a well intentioned lie, is always a lie, and sooner or later you have to pay for it. Richard tensed visibly, his hand on the back of Charlotte's chair clenched into a fist. I knew what he was thinking. Was I really going to go public with his financial shenanigans? But I had no such intention. This was an evening about the final touch, about a new chapter in my life, not about revelations. What I've learned over the years is that true relationships, whether family, friendship, or business, must be built on honesty, respect, and mutual support. Without this foundation, any building will sooner or later collapse, no matter how beautiful it may seem on the outside. I saw Charlotte nod slowly, and her gaze stayed on Richard for a moment, a thoughtful, evaluating look. So today, as I hand over control of the final touch to Jeremy, I'm also opening a new chapter in my personal life, a chapter that will be based on truth, on sincerity, on abandoning pretense. I raised my glass. To new beginnings, to honesty, to a life that never ceases to amaze. The room cheered the toast, and the buffet began. Jeremy was the center of attention. Journalists, critics, everyone wanted to know about his plans, about how the restaurant would change under his leadership. I watched him with pride. He held himself with confidence, answered intelligently and substantively. The finishing touch was in good hands. Richard disappeared into the crowd almost immediately, obviously avoiding me. Charlotte approached as I stood at the window watching the guests. "Beautiful speech, Mother," she said quietly, "especially the part about honesty." "Thank you, dear." I squeezed her hand lightly. "I spoke from the heart." "I know," she nodded. "And I think you're right. About everything. About honesty. About respect." She stopped, as if hesitant to continue. "About Richard?" I suggested gently. Charlotte sighed. "I checked our accounts, Mother, everyone I could get my hands on, and I talked to a few people in his company. You were right. He's on the verge of bankruptcy, and he used my money, the money I got from my dad, to make risky investments. Without my knowledge, I kept quiet, letting her talk. When I asked him about it, he denied it, said I didn't understand the complexities of the business, that everything was under control. And then I found a second cell phone with messages to a woman named Emma. They've been together for 2 years, Mom." I closed my eyes for a moment. So, on top of everything else, Richard was cheating on my daughter. I can't say it surprised me, but it didn't make it any easier to see Charlotte's pain. "I'm so sorry, darling." "Don't be." She straightened up, and I could see the determination in her eyes. "I'm glad I found out the truth about everything, about you, about him, about our marriage. 15 years of living a lie is enough, don't you think?" I hugged her, feeling her shudder with held back tears. "What are you going to do?" "I already did," she replied, pulling away. "I filed for divorce yesterday. Richard doesn't know that I'm not here today, just out of politeness. I came to tell you that I'm leaving him." I looked at her with amazement and pride. My daughter had finally found the strength to break up with a man who had manipulated her, lied to her, cheated on her for years. "Are you sure?" I asked, even though I knew the answer. "Absolutely," she nodded. "It won't be easy, especially with his financial problems. He won't want to let me go for nothing. But I'm ready to fight." "You're not alone, Charlotte." I squeezed her hand. "I'm here for you. Always." She smiled the first time I'd seen a real smile in a long time, without strain, without fear of not pleasing. "I know, Mom, and I'm glad we can finally start over. To be a real family." At that moment, Richard walked up to us. His smile was strained, his eyes cold. "Charlotte, darling, we have to go." he said in a tone that didn't invite objection. I have an important meeting tomorrow, and I need to get ready. Charlotte gave me a quick glance, then turned to her husband. I'll stay, Richard. I want to spend the evening with my mother, to celebrate her new stage of life. His face contorted with anger for a moment, but he quickly pulled himself together. Of course, darling, whatever you say. He turned to me with a fake smile. Congratulations, Virginia. That was a great speech, especially the one about, honesty. Thank you, Richard, I replied calmly. I'm glad it touched you. He nodded, glanced at Charlotte once more this time with ill-concealed irritation, and left. I saw him stop, chatting with guests, smiling and shaking hands, the perfect son-in-law in public, until the last minute. He doesn't know I know about Emma, Charlotte said quietly. He doesn't know about the divorce petition either. He'll find out tomorrow when my lawyer calls him. You've already consulted a lawyer? I couldn't hide my surprise. 3 days ago, she nodded. I've learned a lot from you, Mom. I've learned a lot from you, Mom, including that sometimes you have to act decisively and without warning. I couldn't help but smile. My daughter was coming back, the strong, determined woman she always should have been, before Richard began methodically suppressing her will. We spent the rest of the evening together, socializing with the guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes. I introduced Charlotte to Jeremy and the rest of the Final Touch team, no longer as Madame Hugh's daughter, but as a woman who may soon become part of our extended family. I'm thinking of trying my hand at the restaurant business, she said as we said goodbye to our last guests. Not as a chef, of course, maybe in the financial part or in organizing events. I've always loved cooking, remember? Before Richard said it was unstylish. I remember, I nodded. You had talent, and I'm sure it hasn't gone away. When everyone had gone, Charlotte, Jeremy, and I stayed in the empty restaurant. I looked around the room, a place that had been the center of my life for 6 years, that I had built from scratch and was now putting into new hands. Don't be sad, Mrs. Hughes, Jeremy said, noticing my gaze. You will always be welcome here, at any time. I know, darling, I smiled, but it's time for a new chapter, for all of us. Charlotte and I walked out into the warm summer night. She took me under her arm, a gesture I hadn't seen from her in years. Where to now, Mother? She asked. I mean, what are you going to do? I looked up at the starry sky, feeling strangely calm and confident. I don't know, dear. Maybe write a book. Maybe travel. Maybe I'll just enjoy life. For the first time in a long time, I don't have a plan, and exciting. That sounds wonderful. She squeezed my hand. Can I join in? To some parts, at least. I think we could both use a fresh start. I'd love to, I replied, feeling tears come to my eyes, not from sadness, but from happiness, from relief, from hope. We walked down the night street, mother and daughter, two women starting new chapters of their lives. There was a lot of uncertainty ahead. Charlotte's divorce, my new position as the restaurant's honorary consultant, the rebuilding of our relationship after so many years of miscommunication. But there was also something certain. We were both finally free of the lies that had poisoned our lives for years. Me from pretending to be a poor widow, Charlotte from the illusion that her marriage was based on love and respect. The truth, however bitter, is truly liberating, and it gives a chance for a new beginning, more honest, more open, more real. And what could be more valuable than that?